mean, it doesn't make any
so
sense.
He's going to tell me that I'm
Just
wrong. He
doesn't
isn't.
spend
It's
a
wrong.
day in the real world in his entire
listen to this, and
life.
it makes me dumber
This
here
is
in my suit
crazy.
jacket, being so
How
intelligent.
can you know
I
anything
can't
about
possibly
policy?
hear it. I'm out here every day.
Policies make no
doing
sense.
real work.
What's going on YouTube? Jamie Potter here, PhD in Organizational Behavior from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. My goal in this channel is to unlock the value of research for organizations, and today I am looking at a topic that has a long history in the social psychology literature, and that is the idea of intergroup prejudice and intergroup conflict. And in particular, I want to look at one form of it today, a really important form at this point in the world and in our country, and that is in terms of intergroup conflict between political parties, between Democrats and Republicans. We are at moments of absolute historic political polarization at the moment, and it's not only polarization of ideas, it's really an animosity. There's a lot of emotion behind it. There's almost what feels like a hatred of the other group and an inability or lack of desire to even hear what this other group has to say, and that can be really problematic, especially when it's half of the country. So what I wanted to do here was dig into the literature in social psychology in particular to find out, how did we get to this point? And undoubtedly there are so many reasons for this, and I hope you'll comment below if you have additional reasons, but I'm going to dig into just one that I find pretty interesting that has sort of a social psychological lens to it. And then beyond that, I want to look also into the social psychology literature to understand what are potential cures for this. And I shouldn't say cures, but ways to sort of lessen this animosity or this polarization we've arrived at. And so one of the many reasons we've arrived here has to do with how we consume media these days, and that is mostly via television, a 24-hour news cycle, and partially that has resulted in a need for news stations to kind of get more extreme, right? There's a lot more just sort of yelling and incivility in the news than we've ever seen.
Answering again. You haven't even let the sentence finish.
You're not answering.
And interestingly, I dug into the research there, and actually one of my favorite professors, Diana Mutz, who I was fortunate enough to actually have several meetings with while at Penn. She's a professor of political science as well as communication, and specifically political communication. She did a fantastic study in 2007 and actually had looked at this idea previously in a slightly earlier study of how does TV media impact our political views and how we feel about the other party. And what she found is very instructive in terms of how we've arrived at this position of extreme polarization and animosity. So what she did is she conducted an experiment. She manipulated two different variables in what's called the 2x2. I'll put a little diagram of it up here to sort of explain what that is. So the one thing that she manipulated in these videos, participants would come into the laboratory and they would watch some pre-recorded news footage that the experimenter had made up in advance. And what was being manipulated is, for one, the civility of the discussion. In some cases, participants were coming in and seeing a very civil discourse. In others, they were seeing a very uncivil discourse. In other words, a lot of yelling, some personal insults, etc. The other dimension, interestingly enough, that was manipulated is how close the camera was to you. And Diana really draws on the social psychological research in deciding to even manipulate this variable. Because what she found is, in face-to-face interactions, where you're very close to someone, their emotions spread to you more easily. So what she wanted to look at is this idea that if the camera in the news is sort of farther back, right? It's not as close to you, you're seeing a sort of a wider view, versus it is up very close, right? You can really see the emotions, you can see the anger, you can see the person sort of seething. If that has a larger impact on the viewer in terms of how much they dislike that person or dislike the views of the other side, or even how illegitimate they see the views of the other side as being. And so what she finds in this series of experiments is sort of what you'd expect. in the case of the uncivil and very up-close camera, participants actually rate the person if they disagree with them, they dislike them more, and also, interestingly enough, they rate the ideas that they have as being less legitimate. So it's actually causing people to feel this whole group is illegitimate. It's not just this one person that I dislike. I dislike the whole group, and I don't trust any of their ideas. So this sort of small research stream that Diana has kind of fostered shows us that this TV news cycle is really not helping the case, and if anything, it's driving this polarization in a lot of ways. But as with anything in social psychology, if there's a problem, there have been solutions proposed. So let's look at two potential solutions. Again, I could probably dig into the literature and find 10 or 15, but what I want to do is provide sort of an older seminal solution, and then a newer kind of interesting one that's just been actually published in 2020, this year. So first, the older solution. This goes back to 1954. One of arguably the fathers of social psychology, Gordon Allport, published a book called The Nature of Prejudice. So as you'll know, in 1954, World War II had just ended, and kind of as a side note, a lot of seminal research in social psychology came out at that time. Just the atrocities of the war led a lot of people to be interested in how could this happen, and namely, how can we prevent this from happening again in the future? So in this book, Gordon Allport lays out the very famous contact hypothesis, which essentially says to get two groups to like one another more and to remove prejudices, they have to interact with one another. But it can't just be any interaction. There have to be certain things that are true of this interaction. Namely, there has to be cooperation, there's to be some sort of common goal, there's to be equal status or fairly close status of the two groups, and there has to be some institutional support. And when you have these things, right, about 70 years of research at this point shows that prejudice decreases, liking of the other group increases, there are positive behavioral outcomes in terms of how you treat the other group and how they're humanized. So we have Allport with sort of the seminal contact hypothesis, but we also have this newer paper from 2020 from a student at Harvard Business School and a professor at Harvard. That's a really interesting idea, and it brings in this idea of group meta-perceptions. And what that means essentially is what I think the other group thinks about me. Let's break that down. So if I'm a Democrat, I likely have inaccurate group meta-perceptions about Republicans. And so I think that if I'm going to put a policy in place to save the environment per se, that they're going to look and say, oh, you're doing that for your own self-interest, you don't actually care, this is all bad. So that is my meta-perception. It's what I think they're going to think about my policies or my views or my values. And what they find in this paper is actually, for one, that those group meta-perceptions are often very inaccurate. And the group meta-perceptions are too extreme in particular. I think that the other party or the other group is going to react very badly to my ideas, but in reality, which they show in some of the studies, they actually don't think as badly of my ideas as I think that they will. And so when you start to think about this, what's a possible solution? Sort of a simple one. Give the person who's formed this inaccurate group meta-perception accurate info. And as it turns out, in these studies that they conducted, when you just give someone in one group or one political party more accurate views of what the other party actually thinks, this improves how you feel about them. This lessens hostility, and it also likely will increase my desire to hear their ideas. I'll say, oh, they're not extreme as I was thinking. That extreme feeling I had about them is what was causing me to distance myself and have animosity towards them. When I learned that it's actually not that bad, I'm much more likely to want to have contact with them, and this sort of respectful contact that leads to increased liking, increased understanding of one another, increased empathy, familiarity, similarity, all of these great things. So we've reached a very dark time in terms of the amount of polarization and animosity between political parties in the United States. In this video, I talk about how a large part of that certainly is from how we consume media. We consume it in this television form that's on all the time, where there's a lot of yelling in many cases. It's less presentation of the facts, more emotions, and that actually makes us more polarized. And then I dug into two different ways you can think about how to get around this. For one, put groups into contact that disagree. Put them in contact under specific circumstances, namely equal status, cooperation, common goals, and institutional support. And also kind of dig into these incorrect ideas people have about the other group and try to provide more accurate data that shows, listen, I know you think that they're very extreme, but actually the data would show that they're not. I hope, if anything, what you take away from this is, television news isn't bad. It does keep us informed. Diana Mutz talks about this in her study. It keeps us informed of the other ideas, but it also polarizes us by the amount of emotions it inserts into the news. I hope, if you take one thing away from this, if you're watching news on one side, everyone is a bit partisan, obviously. If you're watching news on one side, try to read in writing. Don't watch the news on the other side, but read the ideas in writing just to get some balance. And I promise you, it'll allow you to see that there is a legitimate side. As much as you think that there's one perspective and that's correct and it's mine, the other side does have points too in a lot of ways. So I hope this literature helps. I hope it's interesting. I'm going to put the takeaways and all the citations at the bottom. And feel free to comment. Please like and subscribe. I'm having a great time making these videos, and I'm going to continue to make them weekly, especially if there are a lot of likes. So thanks so much, and have a good weekend.